When first talking about poetry, the first thing that I can say is in order to learn poetry, you just have to read it. You have to read it and recognize, yes, this is poetry. It's way easier said than done here. What exactly is poetry? Because poetry finds its way in prose, it finds its way in visual art, it finds its way in shorter, concrete words. Me, we. There are plenty of people out there that can sit there all day and argue that that's not poetry. I was raised believing that poetry has to rhyme, there has to be figurative language, you have to be expressing emotions. How the hell does the words me, we constitute as poetry? There's plenty of people who argue that. Funny enough, the people who do argue that stuff, they're not really poets. What they are is that they're literary theorists. They draw more to fiction. Fiction, who, what, where, why, when. Where am I in this scene? In the beginning, this happened. And then in the next scene, this happened. And then the end. Fiction's about understanding where I am in the plot. If you want to know my definitions of poetry, and this is just kind of, again, my personal opinion, poetry is not meant to be understood. It's meant to be felt. It's meant to be experienced. If you want to read something and understand it, read a dime store novel, okay? Read a beach read. That's for understanding. That's for, I want to see a character go through a journey. Poetry is not always that. There is such thing as narrative poetry, poetry that tells a story. But one of the big lines that we can draw between poetry and, say, telling a story through prose is the formatting is part of the experience. When you're reading the poem, you are feeling something more than, say, watching a movie. It's emotions through words. You are using language to express emotions in ways that prose really just can't. It's way too easy to say, I feel sad. Way too easy. And we can just throw that around all day to the point where when someone says, I feel sad, we just go, okay. Poetry doesn't do that. It doesn't. Poetry takes the feeling that you have, but now I want you to express it using the beauty of this language. This language is indirect. English is very broken. Very, very broken. Play with it. Blow up language if you have to. One of the ways in which we can achieve this is what we have to talk about this week as well, which is imagery. Imagery is another thing that really sets apart good writing with bad writing. I have talked to a lot of editors. I have talked to a lot of different publishers, and just about all of them said the exact same thing. When I open your story, when I open your poem, when I open your manuscript, I want to see imagery. I want to see it. Please, for the love of God, do not just say, I am sad or I feel sad. Show me. Show me how you feel sad, okay? Because in real life, we don't directly express our emotions with people. We don't. We are finicky people, okay? We like to hide behind things. And this is why some people argue that poetry is like the rawest of the raw forms of writing. It's because poetry is an outlet in which you can really express intense emotions and match those intense emotions with whatever kind of format that you wish through using words. Another way, of course, is figurative language. Instead of saying, I feel sad, you say, I feel as sad as the lone moon that shines across the river, or something like that, okay? You are using similes, you're using metaphors, stuff that you guys have been taught before in high school English, stuff like personification, automatopoeia, or whatever. All of that stuff is fair play. The crux of poetry is the emotions, but it's also the words and the form that you use. It's not just the words that you put down on the page. When we think of poetry, we think of all the white space. We think of the stanzas. We think of the line breaks, okay? The form is a part of this. The form is a part of you expressing emotion. As of right now, there are over hundreds of different poetic forms. Stuff like the abstract poem, the ballad. You may have heard of some of these. The sonnet. So here's the thing. I am not expecting you all to know these forms. Absolutely not. It's definitely important to know these forms, even though poetry now has been freed. We do not write a lot of formal or fixed poems. Any poem that has a very strict guidelines, very strict, formal, fixed guidelines, those are called formal poems. Some examples are any poem that rhymes. Right now, the schools of poetry are divided into two: the formal and fixed. The other side is free verse, which is go wild. You don't need to follow any form. You're writing as if you're writing anything else. But at least take some of this. Still need to take some of this stuff into consideration, even when you free up poetry. Okay? I absolutely never want to hear in this class that's not poetry. I never want to hear that. Because this form, this genre has been blown up so much, and we're picking up new pieces here and there, it's really, really, really disrespectful to be very strict about what poetry is and what poetry isn't. You may not like it. I'm going to show you some poems that you guys might actually despise and say, I don't get it. But that's fine. That's kind of what art is, right? Art is supposed to shock us. It's supposed to challenge us, isn't it? And especially since poetry is such a vulnerable form. These people are literally laying out their emotions. They know that I'm writing not to be understood. I'm just writing from my experience so you can experience what I'm experiencing. If you walk into a room full of published poets today and start screaming at them that what they write is not poetry, they're just writing prose and they're just pressing the enter key, yeah, sorry, you're going to get kicked out. And that kind of attitude is not respected. So again, this is part of the business side of it. Be open-minded. That's what I can say. I like to call poetry the Wild West. It's a free-for-all. If you write it down and you say it's poetry, okay, it's poetry now. Because who here has the right to say what's poetry and what's not? Absolutely none of us. Poetry has changed. Writing has changed.